Hi, I'm Erin McDowell, recipe developer and cookbook author, and I'm going to show you how to make my sweet and spicy squash and kale pativier. This is such a yummy recipe that starts with a one-pan sort of roasty, yummy vegetable filling, and it's a double crust puff pastry pie that we are going to make with my super easy to make but very impressive looking rough puff pastry. So let's get baking. We can start by making our rough puff pastry dough. This is all the flakiness and layers of puff pastry, but without all the hard work of a butter block and some of the more intense aspects of puff pastry. We are going to start with 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour. And we want to make sure that we season our flour a little bit with some salt. You can use a little teaspoon if you want, but you can also just add a nice hefty pinch in there. And I'm just going to give that a little mix. Now we're going to add our butter. It's really important when you're making rough puff pastry or any kind of pastry dough that the ingredients are cold. So we've got nice cold cubed unsalted butter here, 2 sticks of it. We're just gonna go ahead and add it right in. As I'm adding it in, I'm kind of breaking up some of the clumps of the butter. We don't want these pieces to kind of stay stuck together. We want them each to be separate, and we wanna make sure that each piece is coated fully in flour, just like that. So we're gonna give it a toss. So what we'll do is we'll make sure to start by getting each piece fully coated in flour. And when you have 2 pieces that say stuck together like that, we wanna break them apart and make sure that both the ends get flour too. That's basically how this pastry dough is gonna work. If the butter isn't fully coated with flour, we risk it melting out of the dough in the oven. So it's something we definitely don't want. Once you get all the pieces well coated in flour, you can start to squeeze the butter between your fingers and your thumbs. What's different about rough puff pastry than making things like pie dough or biscuits is that we're only gonna do this one time because we have a lot of folds that are gonna follow it. So we're just going to squeeze each piece of butter flat like this, kind of making a shingled flat piece, and then we'll toss it in some flour. One of the ways I like to do this is by putting all the cubes of butter that I haven't squished yet on one side of the bowl and then kind of tossing it towards the other side once I've squished it. And you might think this is really big pieces of butter to be making a pastry dough with, but we don't want to make the pieces too small because we are going to fold this dough. So as we go through all the folds, we're going to be rolling out that butter even thinner and folding it. So if we start with it too small, we're not gonna end up with as big and beautiful of flakage at the end. Now, this is what it should look like. Really shaggy, really huge pieces of butter that are just basically flattened. Now I'm gonna make a well in the center of the bowl, just like a little hole where we're gonna put some of the flour. Clap my hands to get some of the flour off. We're gonna add a little bit of water to start. So we're just gonna start with a decent splash into the well, and I'm gonna use that tossing motion again to start to bring this dough together. And what's also great about that tossing motion is the heat of your hands can also start to warm up dough. It can make the butter softer, but by tossing, we're not really applying that much heat from our hands. We're just using our fingertips. All right, let's add a little more water. After the initial addition of water, you just want to keep adding more, a tablespoon or so at a time, until the dough starts to come together. And the dough shouldn't be wet or sticky. It should kind of just come together to form a ball. So once it gets to this point where it's kind of starting to hold together a little bit, that's when you can stop that tossing motion and start a little bit of a kneading motion. And I use the word knead somewhat cautiously because you don't want to treat this like bread dough. We don't want to mix this too much, but it's okay to be a little bit more aggressive and forceful just to make sure that everything is uniform and homogeneous. I'm going to give my hands a quick rinse because it's easier to show you the right texture with dry, clean hands. So I'll be right back. So once the dough is done, it should come together all in one ball, but you put your hand down on it and you lift it up and there's nothing coming off on my hand. And that goes to show the level of hydration that it should be. It should be hydrated enough that it comes together in one ball, but not so much so that it's wet or sticky. So now we just need to wrap this dough tightly in plastic wrap, and we're gonna refrigerate it for a little while so it can rest and relax before we start our process of folding. We're gonna form this into a disc. We've wrapped it nice and tight in plastic wrap, and now we're gonna put it into the refrigerator so it can get nice and cool before we start our folds. All right, so our dough is nice and cold now. It had a great time chilling in the refrigerator, and now it is ready to be folded, and let's make some of those flaky layers. So first, I'm going to toss a little bit of flour on my work surface. And it's important to remember that you don't want to use too much flour because that flour is going to incorporate into the dough and it can actually start to make the dough tough if you use way too much. But you need to use as much as you need to use to prevent the dough from sticking. I tend to like to apply a lot of flour to the work surface at the beginning and then not add as much as I'm working, but that's a personal preference. You can do it however you need to make sure that your dough doesn't stick. Okay. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna roll this out to about a ½ inch thick. And it really doesn't need to be precise. The shape, the size doesn't need to be precise. All we want is that thickness of about a ½ inch thick because we want it to be thin enough that when we perform our folds here, we get a good amount of layers. So you can see as I'm rolling out the dough, there's these big, huge, beautiful pieces of butter in the dough. We love to see it. And as we're rolling the dough out, we're shingling that butter even thinner. And we're kind of making it so that as we fold, there's layers, butter and dough and butter and dough and butter and dough. And when that cold butter hits the heat of the oven, you get this sort of release of the moisture in the butter in the form of steam, and that makes the dough puff up and makes these beautiful layers. So I've got it to about a ½ inch thick, and now what I'm gonna do is just fold it into quarters. So just fold it in half. Brush away any excess flour and fold it in half again. If you work quickly, you can sometimes do 2 of these folds back to back, but usually, and especially if you're a beginner, it's a good idea to just toss it back in the refrigerator so it can get nice and cold in between those folds. If it gets too warm, the butter starts to just mush and mash together with the dough, and we don't want that. So let's toss this into the refrigerator after we wrap it. I'm just wrapping it up in the same plastic wrap that I used before. And we're gonna toss it into our refrigerator and get it nice and cool before our next fold. This also gives it a chance for the gluten to relax, which is gonna keep our dough really nice and tender. So the fridge is our friend in this recipe. My dough has been chilling since its first fold. It's time to give it the second. And the second fold is gonna be exactly the same as the first one. We're just gonna roll out our dough. You're gonna find the more you roll out this dough, the less flour you're gonna need. It's gonna continue to get smoother and smoother. You're gonna see less of the big chunks of butter with each fold. And that's the idea because the butter is getting more incorporated into the dough as we work. Just gonna give this a roll. When your dough does something like this and you don't have the shape that you want, like I want this to be a rectangle, you can just sort of pull the dough with your hands in the direction that you want it to go. All right, this is perfect. I'm gonna go ahead and give it a fold. This is the second fold, and we're actually gonna do 4 total. So you can sometimes, like I said, get 2 folds in a row if you want, if you're working quickly. But in general, it's great if you want the best, flakiest results. Just toss it in the refrigerator in between each fold for 20 to 30 minutes. Now that I've got it all wrapped up and I've completed the second fold, I'm gonna follow my own advice and toss it back into the refrigerator so that it can get nice and cold and get a little bit of a rest before we do our 3rd and 4th folds. So this filling is a really yummy filling that starts with roasting some veggies. We're gonna start with the things that take the longest and that we want to get a little bit caramelized and delicious. I wanna prepare my garlic. So I've got a full head of garlic here. I'm just gonna cut off the top and I'm going to put it inside a little bit of foil and drizzle a little bit of olive oil over the top of it because we're gonna add a whole head of roasted garlic to our final filling, and it's going to be so good. So we'll wrap that up nice and tight and set it aside. Now we want to add our butternut squash and our sweet onion. This is about 20 ounces of butternut squash and 1 large sweet onion. And you want to cut them, kind of bite-sized pieces. They are going to cook down, so you don't want to cut them too small that you're not going to have a little bit of texture still. All right, once you get it in kind of an even layer, let's add some more olive oil and we'll give it a nice toss. After we get plenty of olive oil on here to get all of our veggies roasting and roasty and just so yummy, we'll give it a nice seasoning with salt and pepper. We're going to toss it in the oven to roast. I love using a wall oven, particularly when I'm doing something that has multiple components like this, because I can keep an eye on things and know when to add those next ingredients as we hit the next stage. I'm gonna give it a little season with some salt and lots of black pepper. So once we get it all nice and tossed in an even layer, we've got our little garlic packet on there too. We're gonna toss it into the oven until these vegetables start to get tender and a little bit of that roasty look on them. Then we can add our next veggies into it. All right, our veggies have gotten a nice little start to their roast. They're tender. And now we're gonna add our next ingredient, which is some roughly torn kale. Adding the kale at this stage will both cook the kale a little bit. We can even get a little bit of crispness to the kale, which is kind of fun. What it's also going to do is reduce some of the moisture. Greens have a lot of moisture, and if we tried to just put that raw into a pie, we'd end up with a soggy mess inside. So I'm just gonna give that a little toss so that it gets a little bit coated with some of the oil that's still on the tray. Once everything is nice and coated, it's back into the oven to finish cooking off the veggies below, finish getting our garlic nice and roasted, and to cook up this kale too. Wow, it looks amazing, smells so good. Now it's time to just add the final ingredients. So the first is one of my favorite ingredients that exists in the world, peppadew peppers. The one thing about peppadew peppers is that they're not actually spicy. And we want a little bit of spice in this because I just think it livens it up. So I'm gonna add some red pepper flakes. And you can just do this to taste however much you like, and I like spicy. So I'm gonna do a few pinches. All right, I'm gonna give that a little bit of a stir. Then we also want to add 1 tablespoon of honey. The peppadew peppers are sweet, but I like to add just a little bit more of that good flavor in there. So I'm just gonna drizzle my honey. All right, once we get all those things combined, give it a really good toss. You can even hear the kale actually sounds kind of crunchy right now, and that just goes to show that we got all that troublesome moisture out of the kale. Now I'm going to unwrap my roasted garlic. I'm just going to actually squeeze these garlic cloves into the filling and kind of mash them up with my spoon as I stir them to combine. Okay, we're perfect now. We just need to let this cool. You can leave it to cool on the baking sheet and it won't take very long because of that increased surface area, or you can transfer it to a bowl. This is like a nice thing you could do a day ahead if you wanted so that you're ready when it's time to assemble your pativier. All right, let's let it cool. All right, we've got our chilled dough. We gave it a good chill after our final folds, and now we can assemble our pativier. This is actually enough dough for both the top and the bottom. So I'm gonna unwrap it and cut it in half, and we'll get started. I work pretty quickly, so I'm gonna go ahead and just work with both pieces of dough at the same time. Cut it in half. No need to be precise, but if you want to be super precise, you can weigh your dough to make sure that each piece is even. I'm gonna just roll it out to about 1/4 inch thick, and we're trying to get a round shape, but we can also trim it to make it round, so don't fret too much about the roundness. Once we get it to about the shape that we want, I like to go ahead and transfer it, and I transfer it by rolling it up onto the rolling pin like this. We can bring our baking sheet over and just unfurl it right onto the baking sheet. And I'm just gonna use my knife to cut it into a bit of more of a circular shape. Again, this is a pretty rustic puff pastry pie, which is what I love about it, so no need to be a perfect circle. If you do want it to be a perfect circle, you could grab a plate and trace around that, whatever you wanna do. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and scoop our filling onto this. We want to make sure that the filling is totally cool when we add it, because otherwise a hot filling could melt all of that butter, that beautiful butter work that we've done. So I usually add a little bit and kind of spread that into an even layer. We want to leave about a half an inch to an inch at the edge all the way around to give us some room to crimp once we add the top crust. So I like to add some of it and then spoon the rest on top. And when you're spooning the filling on, it's kind of nice to make the center mounted a little higher than the edges. It just makes this pie a little bit more impressive. So the last few spoons, I always just put right in the center. Now we'll set that aside. If your dough feels soft after this portion of the assembly, again, you could toss it into the refrigerator before you continued. So we'll roll out the second piece of dough the same way that we rolled out the first. Moving the dough a lot while you're working with it is another way to help prevent it from sticking without having to add more flour. So that's why you see me picking up the dough and throwing it around a lot. All right, let us unfurl. Ooh la la. So the first thing you want to do after you get that top crust on is just lift it up a little bit at the edges and really press it down. We want to make sure there's no air pockets between the pieces of dough. This is already a really puffy dough, so it has a tendency to really want to kind of spring up anywhere where we give it any wiggle room. So I'm kind of just pressing around the filling. I'll bring my knife back in and cut away some of the excess from the top crust. You can save these little scraps of dough, toss them in some cinnamon sugar, and just eat those as little puff pastry snacks. Beautiful. All right, so the easiest way to crimp a pativier like this is just to use a fork, and I'm just gonna keep it nice and simple and do that. Sometimes you can dip your fork in a little bit of flour. And we're just gonna crimp it all the way around. You wanna be pretty firm with this to make sure that you're really adhering the top crust and the bottom crust together. When I get to the edges, sometimes I pull the paper over a little bit so it's easier to access those edges. Lovely. Wow, this already looks so amazing. We can just go ahead and give this a quick coating of egg wash. I coat just the surface of the crust in egg wash, not these edges. The edges are always gonna brown faster because they're not as thick as the rest of the pie, so they don't need any extra help from egg wash. We're just gonna add the egg wash to the center portion of dough. That's the part that we wanna make sure really browns nice and evenly. The pie is egg wash, it's ready to go. If it was feeling at all soft at this point, you might wanna toss it back in the fridge for a few minutes before you bake, but I'm ready to go right now. I'm gonna toss it into the oven and we're going to bake it until it's deeply golden brown and very, very crisp. The kitchen's gonna smell amazing. Wow, it looks so, so pretty, and you know that it's done because it's got this deep golden brown color all over. And as amazing as it smells, we don't want to cut into it just yet. Pastry like this is kind of delicate and it needs to cool at least a little bit so that the structure can set. 5 to 10 minutes of cooling is usually enough if you can't wait, but you can even let it go as much as 20 to 30 minutes and serve it more at room temperature. All right, I think it's time to take a little slice. Or a big slice. It's more my style. Ooh, the crunch, the flake, it has it all. Oh my gosh. Ooh. All right. This is a nice and warm kale and squash pativier in a flaky crust. It's a little bit sweet, a little bit spicy, and all those veggies are wrapped in that buttery, flaky, so easy to make rough puff pastry dough. You can hear the flake and the crunch in the crust just when I hit it with the fork. Flaky and crisp and not a soggy bottom in sight. This is a great puff pastry pie.